Autumn had painted the small town of Rivenmoor in amber and gold as Evelyn Breyer stepped off the train, her boots crunching against the fallen leaves. Her heart thudded like a drum in her chest as she walked down the winding lane that led to the place she hadn't seen in 16 years, Stonefield House. It stood just as she remembered, an imposing structure of brick and ivy, framed by iron gates that once felt like prison bars but now looked strangely welcoming. The building had undergone clear renovations. The peeling paint and broken shutters from her youth had been replaced by bright murals, polished windows, and flower beds blooming with life. Children's laughter echoed from the courtyard, an unfamiliar but comforting sound. Evelyn, now 28, was a nurse working in a bustling city hospital. Her dark chestnut hair was pinned in a low bun, and her uniform peeked out from beneath her travel coat. But beneath the composed surface, anxiety twisted in her stomach. This was not just a visit, it was a return to where everything had started, and where so much had been left unfinished. At the gate, she was greeted by a kind-faced woman with cropped silver hair and a soft voice. "Evelyn Breyer? I'm Margaret Hill, the current director." Evelyn smiled, nervous. "Yes. Thank you for having me." Margaret hugged her without hesitation, her embrace firm and familiar. "It's so good to have you back. My, you've grown into such a fine woman." Evelyn was caught off guard by the warmth. She had braced herself for distance, for cold professionalism. But Stonefield had changed. As they walked through the corridors, Evelyn took in the vibrant walls covered in children's art, laughter spilling from rooms that had once felt hollow. The dormitories, where she once lay awake at night, wondering if anyone would ever come for her, now felt cozy and welcoming, with modern bunks and personal touches in every corner. She paused before a large collage of photographs mounted on the hallway wall. Faces from different eras, different childhoods. She spotted her younger self, 8 or 9 years old, hair in messy braids, standing with a group of girls in ill-fitting uniforms. A cold pang ran through her chest. "I remember that day," she murmured, touching the frame. Margaret observed her with gentle understanding. "We kept many of the older photos during the renovations. A way to honor the past." Evelyn nodded, the nostalgia rising like a tide. "It's overwhelming." Margaret hesitated, then gestured toward a narrow side hallway. "There's something else. Something we found during construction. Well, it has your name on it." Curious and unsettled, Evelyn followed her into a quiet records room tucked away behind the old library. Margaret unlocked a cabinet and retrieved a box. It was plain cardboard, aged with time. On top, written in delicate cursive, was her name, Evelyn Breyer. "We discovered it hidden behind one of the old filing cabinets," Margaret said softly. "No one knew it was there. But we believe it was meant for you." Evelyn stared at the box, her breath catching. She reached out slowly, her hands trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside were letters, stacks of them, yellowed with age and tied in faded ribbons. Each envelope was addressed to her. Each one bore the same handwriting. Her fingers brushed against the first envelope, and a chill ran down her spine. "They're from my mother?" she asked, voice barely audible. Margaret nodded. "Yes. They were never delivered. We believe someone meant to give them to you, but they got misplaced or intentionally hidden. I can't say for sure." Evelyn couldn't speak. Her chest tightened with emotions she had long buried. Anger. Hope. Longing. The woman she had only seen in dreams and wondered about through years of therapy had written to her. "Would you like some privacy?" Margaret asked gently. "My office is quiet. Take all the time you need." Evelyn nodded, cradling the box as though it contained glass. "Thank you." Moments later, she found herself in a softly lit room, seated in a worn but comfortable chair, the box of letters on her lap. Her hands trembled as she opened the first envelope. "My darling Evelyn. If you're reading this, I pray it means you've grown into the strong, kind person I always believed you would be." Her mother's words were full of warmth and sorrow, weaving a story of a young woman named Isabel who had made the impossible decision to leave her daughter at Stonefield. The letters spoke of love and fear, of deep regret and endless hope that one day they might meet again. Tears spilled down Evelyn's cheeks as she read. Each letter was a window into a life she had never known. And each sentence carried the same comforting phrase. Love is patient, love is kind. The words repeated like a prayer, a lifeline through years of silence. By the time she finished the fifth letter, her hands were damp, her face streaked with tears, and her soul lighter. When she finally emerged from the office, Margaret was waiting. Evelyn looked at her with tear-stained eyes and a soft, astonished smile. "I didn't even know how much I needed this," she whispered. Margaret pulled her into a warm hug. And for the first time in a long time, Evelyn Breyer didn't feel like a lost child searching for answers. She felt found. The box of letters never left Evelyn's side in the days that followed. She read them on the train back to her apartment, beneath the quiet hum of the city's evening rush. She read them late at night, curled under a blanket on the couch, her bedside lamp casting a soft golden glow across pages worn with time. Each letter unraveled a bit more of the mystery that had shaped her life. Isabel. That was her name. A name Evelyn had only seen once before, on a half-faded birth certificate tucked in her childhood records. The letters gave life to that name. Isabel was no longer a silhouette in Evelyn's imagination, she was a living, breathing young woman who had poured her fears, hopes, and longing into every word. Evelyn learned that Isabel was 22 when she gave birth, alone, frightened, and disowned by her family. The letters described the isolation of carrying a child while trying to navigate a world that had closed its doors. The father had vanished, leaving only broken promises behind. Faced with no job, no support, and no roof over her head, Isabel had placed Evelyn at Stonefield House, believing, praying, it would give her daughter a better life than she could. Evelyn sobbed over paragraphs written with trembling hands, over the guilt that Isabel seemed to carry with every stroke of the pen. But more than anything, Evelyn felt the love that threaded through each line. A desperate, unwavering love. She didn't know what she was looking for when she picked up the phone days later to call Margaret. "I want to find her," Evelyn said simply. Margaret paused on the other end of the line. "Your mother?" "Yes. If she's out there. I need to know. I need to see her." Margaret offered her full support. Within a day, the orphanage reached out to a few contacts, social workers, city records offices, people who could help navigate the labyrinth of missing connections. It didn't take long. Isabel Whitlow. Now 50, she lived just a few towns over in the coastal village of Elmbridge, working part-time at a second-hand bookstore and volunteering at a shelter for young mothers. She never married, Margaret told Evelyn quietly. Never had any other children. Evelyn stared at the photo they'd found, a candid image taken at a community event. The woman had soft features, deep brown eyes that mirrored Evelyn's own, and a distant look in her gaze, as if she were always waiting for something, or someone. A meeting was arranged. Evelyn chose a small cafe halfway between their towns, tucked on a quiet side street, where the scent of vanilla and old wood lingered in the air. She arrived early. The box of letters sat beside her on the table, a silent witness. Her fingers tapped nervously on the rim of her coffee cup. Her heart beat so loudly she wondered if others could hear it. Then the bell above the door jingled. Evelyn turned, and time stopped. A woman entered with hesitant steps, wearing a soft gray sweater and a scarf that looked hand-knitted. Her eyes scanned the room, anxious, searching. And then they found Evelyn. The recognition was immediate, as if the letters themselves had drawn the map. Isabel's hand flew to her mouth. Tears formed instantly in her eyes. Evelyn rose slowly, legs trembling, emotion swelling in her chest like a wave. They stood for a heartbeat, frozen in the space between longing and disbelief. Then Isabel stepped forward, voice breaking. "Evelyn?" "Yes," Evelyn whispered. "It's me." In the next instant, they were in each other's arms. Neither could speak. Their tears said more than words could. The embrace held the weight of decades, of absence, guilt, love, and dreams finally answered. When they parted and sat across from each other, Evelyn placed the box gently on the table between them. "I read every letter," she said. "More than once." Isabel wiped her eyes. "I never knew if they were getting to you. I wrote them for years. Until I had no more hope left. I'm sorry you had to write them at all." "No," Isabel said softly. "It was the only way I knew to still be your mother. Even from a distance." Evelyn reached across the table, taking her hand. It trembled under her touch. "I'm not here to shame you," Evelyn said. I don't want to reopen wounds. I want to know you. Isabel's eyes overflowed again. I would love that. More than anything. They talked for hours. Isabel spoke of the night she gave Evelyn away. The rain. The empty hallway of Stonefield. How she stood outside the gate for almost an hour before finding the strength to leave. She told Evelyn about the jobs she worked, the nights she spent staring at a crib she never got to use, the birthdays she celebrated in her heart. Evelyn, in turn, told Isabel about growing up, about the lonely nights in the dormitory, the friends who came and went, the longing that lived quietly in the corners of her childhood. They discovered things in common, a love of old poetry, a shared habit of doodling in the margins of notebooks, and an identical laugh that surprised them both. But one thing stayed with Evelyn long after they said goodbye that evening, Isabel's confession as they stood on the sidewalk under the glow of a lamppost. I wanted to come find you, she said, voice raw. So many times. But I was afraid. That I'd be nothing more than a ghost you hated. Evelyn shook her head, tears returning. You were never a ghost, she whispered. You were a question I've finally answered. They hugged again, this time not from grief, but from peace. Later that night, Evelyn lay awake in her apartment, staring at the ceiling. She didn't know where this newfound relationship would lead. She didn't know how long it would last, or how deeply they could reconnect. But she knew one thing for certain. The woman behind the words was real. And now, she wasn't reading from a distance anymore. She was living it. The sun was barely rising when Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, a half-eaten bagel growing cold on her plate. Her mind wasn't on food or work or even her to-do list, which typically ruled her mornings like a tyrant. Today, her thoughts were entirely occupied by one name. Lillian. Isabel had mentioned it at the end of their first meeting, in a trembling voice just above a whisper. You weren't born alone, Evelyn. You had a sister. A twin. The words had hung in the air like a fog, wrapping around Evelyn's heart and freezing her in place. A sister. Not just a sibling. A twin. The revelation came with the force of a tidal wave. Evelyn hadn't stopped thinking about it since. She'd always sensed something missing, not in a tragic, obvious way, but more like the soft take of a puzzle with one piece gone. Some unspoken emptiness had followed her through childhood. Now it had a name. Lillian. Isabel had given both girls up at birth, believing it was the only way to protect them. Stonefield had taken in Evelyn. Another orphanage, a town away, had taken Lillian. They were never reunited. Isabel admitted she had located Lillian a few years ago but hadn't found the courage to reach out. The guilt had paralyzed her. But now, with Evelyn back in her life, she wanted to try. She's a social worker, Isabel had said, wiping tears from her cheeks. Helping children like you were, like she was. She's strong. Kind. You'd be proud. Evelyn had nodded numbly. Proud? She didn't know how to feel yet. Curiosity warred with fear. What if Lillian didn't want to meet? What if their personalities clashed? What if she resented being found? But above all that noise, one feeling rose like morning light over fog, hope. A few days later, Evelyn stood in a park in Mayfield, the quiet town where Lillian lived and worked. The meeting had been arranged carefully, with Isabel's help and Lillian's cautious agreement. Evelyn arrived early. She always did. Nerves had pulled her out of bed at dawn, and she'd paced her apartment until it felt smaller than ever. Now, she sat on a wooden bench by a row of tulips, her palms damp, eyes scanning every figure in the distance. Then she saw her. A young woman walking with slow, hesitant steps along the paved path. Hair a few shades lighter. Same height. Same build. Same eyes. When their gazes locked, Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. It was like looking into a mirror painted by a slightly different hand. They stood across from each other in silence, just a few feet apart. Hi, Lillian said, voice barely above a whisper. Hi, Evelyn echoed. Neither moved at first. Then Lillian stepped forward. Evelyn mirrored her. They embraced. Not like strangers. Not like old friends. Like people who had found something they didn't know they were missing. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying. Lillian let out a breathy laugh. I thought I was imagining you. I thought you'd be taller, Evelyn joked, wiping her eyes. They both laughed. It felt easy. They found a shaded bench near the park's pond and talked, really talked. The conversation, though awkward at first, unfolded with a natural rhythm. They took turns sharing memories, childhood moments, and the gaps that had shaped them. Lillian had spent her youth in a different but similarly underfunded orphanage. Her path to social work had started from watching younger kids age out of the system and fall into hard lives. Like Evelyn, she had channeled her pain into helping others. "We both became caregivers," Evelyn said at one point, shaking her head. "That's unbelievable." "Maybe not," Lillian replied. "Maybe some part of us always knew the other existed. We were taking care of the world while waiting to take care of each other." That made Evelyn tear up again. They shared strange coincidences, both loved pistachio ice cream, hated loud parties, loved handwritten letters. Both journaled at night. Both had nightmares about being forgotten. "It's like pieces of us kept matching, even when we were apart," Lillian said. Evelyn nodded. "It's eerie. And amazing." Later, they walked the garden path side by side, brushing hands like they had walked that way for years. Their steps matched. Their shadows merged. By the time they parted that afternoon, they had exchanged numbers, promises, and something unspoken, a vow that this would not be a fleeting reunion. That night, back in her apartment, Evelyn stood in front of the bathroom mirror. She looked into her own face, but saw something new now: connection. It wasn't just about finding Lillian. It was about finding herself through Lillian. The missing piece had never been an absence, it had been a bond waiting to be restored. From then on, they spoke nearly every day. Voice messages, photos, video calls. The first time Lillian said "Hey, sis," Evelyn cried for 10 minutes. Weeks later, they arranged a visit to Stonefield House. They returned together. This time, Evelyn walked through the gates not alone but with her twin beside her. Margaret greeted them both with misty eyes and open arms. She led them to the dormitories, the mural walls, the same hallway where Evelyn had once touched her childhood photo. Now, she stood in front of that photo again, with Lillian. "Do you remember this place?" Lillian asked softly. "No. But I remember the feeling," Evelyn replied. "Of waiting." Lillian took her hand. "You don't have to wait anymore." Evelyn smiled, heart full. Not all stories get second chapters. But theirs had just begun. The following months blossomed like a garden in spring, carefully tended, a little uncertain at first, but full of promise. Evelyn and Lillian, once strangers separated by time and circumstance, were now inseparable. What had begun as a fragile reconnection grew into something deeper, a shared life, a shared purpose, and the slow, steady healing of old wounds. They started meeting weekly, sometimes in Mayfield, sometimes in Rivenmoor. One Saturday it was a hike through a forest trail, the next, a night of takeout and movies on Evelyn's couch. They fell into the comfort of siblinghood with a strange ease, as though the years apart hadn't diminished the bond that was always meant to exist. But it wasn't without challenges. There were awkward pauses, moments when questions hung in the air, too delicate to ask. There were differences in habits, preferences, even how they expressed affection. Evelyn was methodical and soft-spoken, while Lillian had a fire behind her calm exterior, a tendency to say what she felt without filtering. But they adapted, gave each other space, and met in the middle. And then came the idea, almost too obvious once it was said aloud. "We should do something together," Lillian said one evening over cups of peppermint tea. "Something that gives back. That honors what we've been through." Evelyn looked up, curious. "What do you mean?" "I mean a project," Lillian explained, her eyes lighting up. "For kids like us. Who are growing up in the system. Who need to know they're not forgotten. That they can heal. That family can find them, even when they don't expect it." Evelyn's heart stirred. "You mean something like a program?" "A garden," Lillian said. Evelyn blinked. "A what?" Lillian smiled. "A garden at Stonefield House. We start there. A physical space for kids to learn, to breathe, to feel grounded. And we use it as a platform, emotional workshops, journaling sessions, peer mentoring. You with your nursing background, me with my social work. We can make it real." It sounded almost too beautiful. And yet, completely right. The next week, they approached Margaret at Stonefield House with a proposal. She was so moved by the idea that she cried right there in her office, her hand trembling as she clutched the folder Lillian had put together. "This," she said, "this is exactly what these children need." The planning began that same day. The garden, which they named the Root Room, was given a plot of land behind the main dormitories, once overgrown with weeds and forgotten furniture. Within weeks, volunteers were clearing the space, children planting seeds with little hands and wide eyes, and local donors pitching in materials. But it wasn't just vegetables and flowers they planted. It was memory. It was identity. It was therapy. Evelyn led mindfulness sessions in the mornings, sitting with small groups of children as they breathed in the scent of rosemary and basil. Lillian created art corners, where kids could draw their feelings, map out family trees, or simply scribble freely with markers and chalk. Together, they hosted story circles where they shared pieces of their own journeys, not always with details, but with honesty. Sometimes, Evelyn would say to a little girl named April who had trouble sleeping, "We grow through the cracks. Like wildflowers. Not despite the brokenness, but because of it." The children listened. And more importantly, they responded. Some began opening up. Others asked questions. A few simply smiled more often. The garden flourished. So did Evelyn and Lillian. One morning, while Evelyn knelt to adjust the tomato stakes in one corner, she looked up and saw Lillian standing by the stone path with a boy on her shoulders and another tugging at her arm. "Can you believe this?" Evelyn asked, breathless with wonder. Lillian looked over, sweat glistening on her brow, eyes soft. "It's more than I ever dreamed." Evelyn wiped her hands on her pants and stood, surveying the space. Raised beds, rows of carrots and strawberries, hand-painted signs by the children. A wooden bench engraved with a quote Lillian had chosen. "You are not what you lost. You are what you grow." And off to the side, under a newly planted cherry blossom tree, stood a small metal plaque. In honor of Isabel Whitlow. For the seeds she planted in courage and love. Isabel had been deeply moved when they brought her to see the garden. She visited often, helping with tea sessions or reading stories aloud under the blossom tree. The children called her Miss Bell. Sometimes she would sit quietly, hands folded, as she watched Evelyn and Lillian guide the little ones through tasks she never had the chance to do with them. She never asked for recognition. Just being there was enough. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in warm amber, Evelyn sat on the edge of the plot, legs stretched out, a cup of mint tea in her hand. Lillian dropped beside her, holding a spade like a badge of honor. "Still surreal?" she asked. "Every single day." Lillian took a breath, the kind that feels like an exhale after years of holding in grief. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" "All the time," Evelyn replied. "But then I remember. If things had been different, I might never have found you." Lillian reached out and linked their fingers. "Me too." They sat like that in silence, the garden glowing softly in the twilight, filled with the sound of children's laughter and wind brushing the petals. It wasn't a perfect story. But it was theirs. And they were growing something beautiful from the broken pieces. Together. A year after Evelyn returned to Stonefield House, the orphanage no longer felt like a place frozen in her past. It had become something entirely different, alive with purpose, love, and renewal. The garden she and Lillian built, affectionately known by the children as the Heart Patch, had taken root not just in the soil, but in the hearts of everyone who stepped onto its winding paths. Evelyn sat under the cherry blossom tree, now in full bloom, its soft pink petals fluttering like confetti in the wind. In her lap rested a leather-bound journal, a gift from one of the older children who had completed their final art therapy session. The child had scribbled on the inside cover in crooked letters, "Thank you for helping me grow." Across the garden, Lillian knelt beside a group of younger children planting lavender. She wore her hair up in a messy bun, her sleeves rolled past her elbows, laughing as a little boy accidentally flung soil into the air. Isabel, now a regular presence at the orphanage, sat on a nearby bench, knitting slowly, humming a lullaby no one had heard in decades. This unexpected union, was more than Evelyn had ever imagined. She had come to Stonefield to confront a ghost. Instead, she found a mother, a sister, a mission, and, most of all, herself. Later that afternoon, the three women gathered around a picnic table for tea. It had become their Sunday ritual: hot mugs, shared stories, and gentle laughter under the open sky. The children buzzed around them like bees, tending to plants, chasing butterflies, or helping decorate the fence with handmade wind chimes. "I can't believe how far this place has come," Isabel said, smiling as she watched a girl hang a sun-shaped ornament on the gate. Evelyn nodded. "I used to think the past was something I had to escape. But maybe I just needed to face it. And let it teach me." Lillian reached for her cup, her eyes thoughtful. "Funny how we kept trying to find home out there in the world, when all this time, it was waiting for us. Right here." They sat in silence for a moment, each reflecting on the unlikely path that had brought them together. No one spoke of the pain anymore, not because it was forgotten, but because it had transformed into compassion, into purpose. The following month, Evelyn was offered a position at the city's main hospital. A prestigious role. Better pay. A ladder to climb. She turned it down. "I already have my dream job," she told the recruiter kindly. "I help children heal where they were once left behind. There's nothing more important than that." Instead, she officially accepted the title of Wellness Coordinator at Stonefield House, funded now by donors, grants, and the expanding influence of the Root Room. Lillian, already a licensed counselor, had done the same. Together, they began expanding the program to other orphanages in nearby towns. Word of their story had spread. Local news covered the twin sisters who found each other and built a healing sanctuary. Offers for interviews came flooding in. One journalist called it a miracle of sisterhood and soil. But for Evelyn, none of the headlines mattered. What mattered were the quiet moments. The child who spoke for the first time in group therapy. The teenage boy who asked for help instead of running away. The girl who drew a picture of three women under a blossom tree and labeled them "my garden family." And then there was the moment Evelyn and Lillian stood before a new plaque they had commissioned, placed near the heart of the garden, beneath a wooden archway where vines now climbed. "We grew here, not because it was easy, but because love took root where loss once lived." Visitors often stopped to read it. Some cried. Some simply smiled. Some asked questions. And Evelyn answered them all with the same phrase. Every seed deserves a second chance. One warm summer evening, as fireflies blinked along the garden's edge and laughter echoed from the porch steps, Evelyn and Lillian sat side by side on the cherry blossom bench. "Do you ever wonder what our lives would have been like if we hadn't found each other?" Lillian asked. Evelyn looked up at the fading stars, her voice steady. "No. Because this is the only life I want." They held hands, not out of necessity, but out of gratitude. Out of the kind of bond that only time, truth, and unconditional love can forge. The night breeze carried the scent of rosemary and damp earth. And as the moon rose over Stonefield House, Evelyn closed her eyes and smiled. She had not only returned home. She had helped rebuild it.